If you are looking for an unsafe game not made for mass appeal, then I reckon you better jump on the hype train for Path of Exile 2, which will be launching in early access later this year. Over the past 5 years of its development, it has made a ton of strides in good directions, and it is differentiating itself from its predecessor, Path of Exile 1. If you've bounced from that game before, well, let me tell you, Path of Exile 2 is making a ton of huge changes, and many of them are for the better of the game, not only for veteran players, but for new players as well. In fact, in these last 3 months, since the last big playtest in person for Path of Exile 2, when a bunch of content creators, including myself, were flown out to LA to play the game, there have been major changes that fundamentally change many of the systems in Path of Exile 2 for the better. This video is going to go over 7 of those huge changes and explain exactly why they are good for the game and how they are going to bring a bunch of new people into Path of Exile 2. Like I said before, this game is not a safe game. They are taking a risk here. It's a difficult game. It's a dark game. It's going to be complex, but because of all the changes that they're making, based on all the different things about game development that they have learned over the past decade plus of developing Path of Exile 1, I do think there is a chance for this game to have mass appeal at the end of the day. Not because it was made with mass appeal in mind, but because it was made to be a good game. And in the eyes of Grinding Gear Games, the developers, the greatest ARPG of all time. Massive change number 1 is the fact that in Path of Exile 2, you may only use one instance of a support gem across your entire character. Now let me break that down for everybody in the audience here. That means, say you have a support gem called Greater Multiple Projectiles Support. It causes projectiles to split into 4 when you fire one. Now, in Path of Exile 1, you can use that type of support gem on as many different skills as you'd like. Well, in Path of Exile 2, that's not the case. In PoE 2, you can only use Greater Multiple Projectile Support a single time across your entire character. You can't give Ice Shot Greater Multiple Projectile Support. You can't give Gas Arrow that same thing. You can't give the Monk's Wind Strike that. Nope. You can only choose a single skill to use that support gem in. Now, people's immediate reaction, especially historic Path of Exile 1 players, may be negative. However, I do think this is good for the game, and there are a few reasons why. First of all, this type of support gem design caused a lot of stagnation in Path of Exile 1. People would find what the best support gems were, and they would use them for basically every single skill, right? You're just going to optimize damage, the maximum possible damage, into each of your skills. And a lot of the time, it led to monotony in outfitting your character in support gems. With this design, even though it is forced, it means that you're going to have a greater variety of support gems across the various skill gems in your build. You might have 9 different skill gems, but you are not going to have any repeat supports across those 9 skills. Yes, that does mean Grinding Gear Games is going to need to make an absolute ton of support gems and make sure that they are varied enough to be fun and interesting to design characters around, but at the end of the day, this should only make designing new builds more interesting, more compelling, and most of all, more diverse. And we love diversity, don't we? Massive change number 2 also involves gems. And that is the fact that in Path of Exile 2, gems, both support gems, meta gems, and skill gems, do not have colors. That means that you do not need to get specific gems with specific color schemes in them in Path of Exile 2. If you have a gem, you can equip any other gem type inside that gem as long as it fits, right? As long as it applies to the specific skill. You wouldn't put Greater Multiple Projectile Support into a melee skill, that is, using your blade to swing at an enemy, right? You won't be allowed to do that. Path of Exile 2 won't even let you make that mistake. However, there's no longer a blocker when it comes to colors, like in Path of Exile 1. The chromatic orb is gone. You don't need to try to get the perfect colors on certain types of gear or certain gems. When you find something you can use, as long as you have a socket available, you can just slot it right into your gem in Path of Exile 2 and go along on your merry way. Now, the only requirements that gems have now are attributes. That's strength, intelligence, and dexterity. So they're not totally free. You have to pay attention to those stats, but you no longer need to arbitrarily find the proper colors to fit into your sockets. Now, the design decision behind this is kind of funny. They said, well, we just decided to remove it, and it felt better. There was no positive in keeping it. Yeah, it's a historic thing that's in Path of Exile 1, but in Path of Exile 2, we're doing lots of wacky new things. We have WASD. We're launching with cross-play, cross-progression, and couch co-op. We're doing all this stuff. Why not just try this? Oh, and it feels better? Well, we're going to leave it that way. So it's just a win overall. It felt really good in LA when I tested it last week. So I really recommend all of you keep an open mind and not say, oh, they're removing it. They're removing another historic part of Path of Exile 1. Trust me, it feels good. There are a ton of other parameters to build your character around. Massive change number 3 is also going to help new players. People like yourself, if you're watching this video and you bounced from Path of Exile 1 way back when and want to try out Path of Exile 2. They're just continuing to make strides in a positive direction. And this big change is the fact that when you pick a class in Path of Exile 2, you will get a unique starting area in your passive skill tree. Now let me explain exactly what that means. Say we have the Witch and we have the Sorceress. In Path of Exile 2, they'll start in the same location in the big passive skill tree, but they won't have the same nodes at that starting location. The Sorceress will have nodes that relate to elemental damage, let's say fire damage, cold damage, lightning damage. And then the Witch will have nodes relating to minion damage, chaos damage, and curses, perhaps. They won't have overlapping nodes, which is something that we see in games like Path of Exile 1 and what we were going to see in Path of Exile 2, where you're looking at the skill tree, trying to make that first choice, and you're forced into choosing a node that may not fully benefit your character. Well, now your starting area always will benefit that basic archetype of the class that you choose. And if you're an experienced player and you know, okay, I need to path out of this really quickly because I'm doing a crazy build, you'll know that. But if you're a beginning player, you'll always be receiving power boosts in that starting area. If you're a witch and trying to raise a horde of skeletons and zombies and bone constructs, you'll get those minion bonuses. If you're a sorceress, you can buff your lightning damage. That's intuitive and a great change. And for those veteran Path of Exile players watching, if you start as a class besides those two classes and you decide to map your way into that area of the tree for some odd reason, you'll get a mix of both the Sorceress and the Witch's nodes in there. So we're actually going to get a bunch of variations of starting areas in the passive skill tree. It's very cool. The rest of the passive skill tree is going to be the same for all classes. That's classic Path of Exile. But that starting area should be nice and simple and positive for all players starting to play the game. Massive change number 4 might be my favorite of the bunch. And that is the fact that at least in Path of Exile 2's campaign, they have new random encounters and mini-bosses dispersed throughout all the various areas in the game. And these mini encounters that are on top of every area having at least one boss, sometimes two bosses, they have seeded item drops. Yeah, so what that means is that if you decide to go off the beaten path and find this secret, let's say a ritual that's ongoing in the hunting grounds where these foul cultists are trying to raise some abominable beast from below the earth, you can fight that and you'll get a seeded item drop that will help you progress. You know, if you're struggling, you can seek out these secrets. You can explore and be rewarded. Path of Exile 2 is a tough game, and that's why I don't think it's being marketed for people seeking mass appeal, safe games. It's a tough game. It's going to be complex. It's going to be tough, but it has all these features and all this content that I think will make it a game that appeals to the masses because it's just going to be so great. Well, I like this feature because, like I said, the game is hard, and this helps bring up the floor. This is something that the game director of Path of Exile 2 has talked about a lot in the recent past. He saw in prior playtests that people were struggling and they couldn't progress very far into the game because they weren't getting item drops, they just had bad luck, maybe they were a little unskilled, so they added these seeds into the game. And this has helped bringing that floor up. It's not increasing the ceiling because some players are very skilled, they don't need this. But it is bringing up that floor. And that's a good thing. And There's an even cooler thing about this. That's the fact that if you miss one of these encounters, it dynamically will move to another area in front of you, so you get a second chance to find it. I just love that idea. So that is one of my favorite changes between March and June for Path of Exile 2. And if they keep making these little adjustments and additions to the game, man, oh, it's going to be a fun launch experience later this year, maybe November or December, although we're like 90% sure it's November. All right, massive change number 5 is a small one, and it feels super good. So before in Path of Exile 2, your flasks would not refill upon killing normal monsters without any modifiers. Now, it does. All your flasks refill, okay? They refill when you kill normal monsters, they refill a bit more when you kill more powerful monsters, and when you kill bosses, woof, poof, they fly up there. And there are checkpoints and wells in the game where you can fill them to max with ease. Now, when I first played Path of Exile 2 earlier this year, this was not the case, and I felt like I was always progressing backward. I'd have to go back to town to fill up my flasks after almost every pack. When I played it last week, I was always progressing. I felt that forward momentum, and it just felt so much smoother and better, and I enjoyed my experience so much more because of this tiny little change that had massive positive repercussions. And for those of you who just played Path of Exile 1 and bounced, where flasks didn't really matter, I mean, you're pressing flask piano, you constantly are at full flasks. They are a resource in Path of Exile 2, but they are a reactive resource. You're supposed to use them in reaction to enemies, not pressing them constantly to buff your character or anything like that. That's a shift from Path of Exile 1 to Path of Exile 2. Number 6 is the fact that Uncut Gems, which are the things that you find in Path of Exile 2 to carve out any skill gem that you want, are now very widely available in the early game, and I presume throughout the game. And that's great. In addition to that, there are now uncut support gems, so instead of needing to find the proper support gems, you can just cut them and get supports. And when you cut these uncut support gems, it suggests what supports work well with your currently equipped skills. That's phenomenal. It's great. Another new thing to help new players. All this stuff is helping the game appeal to people who may have failed in Path of Exile 1 or are just playing Path of Exile 2 for the first time, or just aren't as skilled, people like myself, people who are going to need this. They don't have an encyclopedia of knowledge in their minds. That's great. And the interface here is wonderful, it's smooth, it's clean, and it just speaks that they're listening to all the feedback from players new and returning and trying to iterate and improve on this game as it leads up to early access release. Yeah, that's right, we're to number 7, which is a big change, kind of. Early access release for Path of Exile 2 is happening this year, 2024, and it's supposedly not going to have all the classes at the start. Now, we heard from some very public leaks from one of the game directors on Path of Exile 2 that the game will have about 8 of its classes, and judging from what we've seen so far, 8 classes, those are likely going to be the Witch, the Sorceress, the Warrior, the Monk, the Mercenary, the Druid, the Ranger, and the Huntress. Those are 8 classes right there. That's probably what we're going to see in early access, which is going to happen in November, we think. It's going to happen later this year. And we're going to have the full campaign. We're going to have some of Endgame. We're going to have one Ascendancy class for each of those classes, at least, to start early access. And that's essentially a prestige class or a specialization that opens up a whole array of new character options for you to explore. We thought that we were going to launch early access with all the classes, but it looks like it's just going to be 8. So that's another massive change, but that's still more than enough to play with. We don't yet know how we're going to get into early access, though I reckon it may be cheaper than a lot of people are pitching. Seriously, it might even be free. Seriously, Path of Exile 2 is on the path to success. I can't wait to play it, stream it, and share it with all of you. Now, let me know, Which of these 7 is your favorite change? Post it in the comments below, and make sure if you liked the video, give it a like. If you want to see more Path of Exile 2 content, subscribe to the channel and hit the sub notification bell. But if you can't wait for my next video, don't worry, I have tons of other videos. Specifically, check out this video right here where I break down the latest revealed class for Path of Exile 2, the Witch. That's all for this one. Talakura, Exiles.